Last week, presidential hopeful Elizabeth Warren released her long-awaited official Medicare for All plan. According to the proposal, it would cost roughly $52 trillion over 10 years.
Now, critics have wasted no time attacking the plan, including Senate colleague and the former presidential contender Bernie Sanders. Joining us for a deep dive into Warren's plan and how it compares to Senator Sanders' bill is journalist Zaid Jilani. Zaid, welcome back to the show.
Great to see you, sir.
So, Zaid, I mean, you've been tweeting a lot about this. Basically, the gripe with Elizabeth Warren, her plan, is that, I mean, in my view, and I borrowed some of this from your analysis as well, is that it was basically a workaround having to say middle-class taxes are going to go up when everybody knows that if you're going to do it, a payroll tax is basically the most efficient way to do it. So it seems like an electoral ploy. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, every country in the world that has universal health care does it basically through employer and employee side payroll taxes and employee contributions. Elizabeth Warren had this year been very vague on health care, not really committing to one plan or another, talking about Medicaid buy-in, other things like that. Eventually she said, I'm with Bernie. I think she kind of backed herself into a corner. Mayor Pete really went after her about costing. And so I think what she did is she told her team basically, guys, let's put together a plan where I can say it doesn't raise middle class taxes. But, you know, as Matt Bruenig and Jared Bernstein, former top econ advisor in the Obama administration, have said, actually it does raise middle class taxes. It just does so indirectly. But this is what politicians always do. When they say we can't raise taxes, when you demonize taxes, you end up designing other mechanisms that still hit the middle class. It's just not as efficient and simple as just a normal like payroll tax.
It's just less transparent. I mean, I saw somebody was saying basically like this was all an effort to trick journalists who aren't that smart or don't understand policy that much into saying that it doesn't raise middle class taxes. And I think from the progressive perspective as well, which is something that Jared Bernstein was also writing about, accepting this framework that all taxes are bad is also not a good place to stand.
Well, let's remember, particularly if you're like a state or a local lawmaker, you can't just like, oh, I'm going to tax Jeff Bezos, right? That your tools that you have at your disposal are like income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. And if you demonize the idea of just basically just raising taxes for people, having them contribute a little bit more, you can't raise money for schools. You can't raise money for transit, for transportation, for healthcare, for childcare, for a lot of the basic needs for homeless, for the poor. Elizabeth Warren is not shifting economic debate, just saying the rich will pay for everything. I mean, that's cheap, like lowbrow populism to me. Really shifting the debate in the United States would be to say, hey, taxes aren't that bad. It's the price that we pay for society, for a decent society. Contributing a little bit more in taxes and just paying less overall because the system would be more efficient and more fair. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's what Bernie Sanders is saying.
And that's really, it's about trust, which is if you're willing to step on that third rail and be like, listen, this is a social contract we're entering. You trust that you, by giving, I'm going to raise these taxes, I'm going to deliver you that system. Well, no, whether that system works out that way, I mean, we can have those debates, but ultimately, it just seems like such a cynical conceit. But another thing I want to talk with you about is, there was a big freak out, we talked about this yesterday, the New York Times poll, of course, which showed basically Warren is not competitive in any of the 6 swing states that Donald Trump won. So I guess a Democrat would have to win 3 out of 6. You were talking a little bit about how Warren has basically made herself beholden to the cultural signaling of the professional managerial class, and that's your theory of why that she's not doing so well. So just expand on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you dig into those polls, actually, like a lot of white working class voters, whites without college degrees, a lot of them actually support economic populist policies. They're not necessarily that turned off by higher minimum wages, universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. But they do tend to be more culturally conservative. Now, Warren has segregated herself a lot in this race. You know, she refused to go on Fox News, whereas, you know, Mayor Pete and Bernie both went on Fox News. She's used a lot of cultural signaling. Like, for instance, she uses the word Latinx to talk about Latino people, which a recent poll found 98% of Latinos do not like having that phrase used on them, which is a very strange thing to do. She gave an answer on gay marriage at a national town hall where she basically made fun of people that don't support gay marriage. Now, 49% of African Americans do not support gay marriage. You can support gay marriage, as Barack Obama did, and get elected nationally, but you can't be a jerk about it, right? I think Warren is behaving in a chauvinistic manner that appeals to a lot of upper-class liberals that look down, I think, on social conservatives, but that could end up alienating key voter blocks in a lot of these more socially conservative states in a way that I think even the economic populist policies are not doing.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, taking this back to the Medicare for All debate, if you look at the polls, Bernie Sanders, who says openly taxes will go up on middle class, but overall you'll pay less, he is much more trusted on healthcare than she is, even though she's gone through this elaborate ritual of making sure she doesn't say those words.
Well, here's the other thing. Medicare for all definitely alienates the medical industry, doctors, pharma, insurance. They'll all fight it. But most corporations will stay on the sidelines because it doesn't really necessarily hurt them. She also wants to boost the corporate tax rate back up to 35% and enforce it much tougher. She's basically bringing in tons more people into the fight. So if you really just look at the politics of their plans, hers is actually much less likely to get passed as a matter of financing, because you're enlisting basically the entire business, every business out there, to fight against it, whereas Bernie's basically just focusing on the medical industry while saying, hey, the average person will pay a little bit more in taxes, but we'll phase it in progressively so that the poor won't pay very much more. But if you earn six figures, you have a Lexus, you can pay a little bit more in payroll taxes.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a winning argument for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I
That's
mean, you
interesting.
pointed this out too, which is that the impact of these taxes is not lost. You tweeted about specifically how she wants to repeal the medical device tax because, of course, medical device companies are all
Bringing
headquartered
home the bacon
in
to Massachusetts.
So she understands fundamentally the impact, and it just goes much more to the point that a lot of this is for perceived electoral benefit, and yet it may not even be helping her.
I mean, that's exactly what it is. I think that she has it in her mind, look, people don't want to pay more taxes, but I can just say some rich guy somewhere will pay more taxes. But even when Obama placed the medical device tax, and there happened to be a lot of those companies in our home state, she's like, no, we got to get rid of that tax. It's hurting our companies, it's hurting our workers. Because at some point, corporate taxes do that. I mean, economists, even on the left, generally don't like corporate taxes that much. They prefer individual taxes, estate taxes, wealth taxes. And the plan that she's described, I think it is largely political. It is largely just saying you won't pay anything more. These really rich guys will, but we know that no country finances healthcare that way. We know it's not realistic or pragmatic to do that. Whereas Bernie is basically doing it the same way the Canadians do it, or Australians, or British, or Germans, or Italians.
I think it's very interesting, though, your point about electability, which I tried to make a version of yesterday, actually, which is basically there are two types of left, right? There's like the cultural signaling leading with the identity issues type of left, which, look, I'm there on all those issues, right? But electorally, it is a more challenging pitch. It's not where swing voters typically are, whereas the economic populist left, Medicare for all, even Green New Deal is fairly popular, guaranteed jobs program, these sorts of things are much more saleable. What's interesting, though, is Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are basically on the same place in all those issues, but it's a matter of how they frame their argument and how they signal on those issues more so than even where they specifically stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a political difference fundamentally. I mean, Bernie Sanders is actually probably a little bit more socially liberal than Elizabeth Warren if you look at their voting records and their long careers.
Their histories,
And their histories. But I think what Bernie understands is, and you have to understand, he gets like 25 or 30% of the Republican vote in Vermont, a state that has a Republican governor. And he consistently outperformed Howard Dean when Howard Dean was governor. A lot of this comes from the fact that Bernie actually understands that you speak to people by speaking to their values. You speak to their values to win them on your issues. If you just speak to your values to other people, you'll often turn them off. And part of this is just that Elizabeth Warren is inculcating a group of upper middle class women, people earning $100,000 or more, people with college degrees, postgrads, people who live in that world where you would use a word like Latinx.
Right.
So I think
or big structural change even.
That's the world that she comes from, though, right, Zed? I mean, and that's so Ross Douthat also wrote about this, which is that ultimately it shows her inability to break out of that as a politician. That for all of this talk, she still remains part of this Harvard set, and that very much shows in all of the choices that she continues to make.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's actually a de-evolution for her, because I think if you went back to 2014 or something, she very rarely would appeal to this cultural liberal set. She'd more talk about economic issues, talk about middle-class families, talk about bankruptcy law.
Yeah.
And I think the course of this primary just shows that she has a hard time broadening herself to a wider issue set. And I think part of that is she's hired just normal Democratic liberal consultants who are telling her, hey, you need to use all the woke language, you need to do all this. And she's just trusting them. And I think she's doing herself some disfavor by doing all this. Because ultimately, you can't talk to, I don't know, it was 10, 15% of America that talks and acts like this. It has these cultural affects. And I think Bernie Sanders really understands this. And honestly, I think Joe Biden understands this.
And Trump.
And Trump, yeah, that's true. I think Warren is really getting herself into an isolated position by behaving in this manner politically.
I would also say I think it's very hard to stay sort of true to your economic populist roots while you are serving in government in this town. Very few people are able to actually pull that off. Zed, thank you so much. Great to have you. Always love when you stop by.
Next on Rising, Senator Bernie Sanders' push to disrupt the Democratic establishment. It's one of the things that sets him apart from the rest of the pack. My conversation with his National Press Secretary, Brianna Joy Gray, when we sat down at Politicon.
Plus, an out-of-this-world discussion with astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. So lame.
Yeah.
Why he says the internet is creating more division and how a cosmic perspective can benefit people's lives. This was a great interview. You definitely want to tune in as Rising rolls on.